The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. Read by Stephen Tomlin. When the time for his university examination drew near, young Malcom made up his mind to go somewhere to revise by himself. He feared the attractions of the seaside, but also he feared completely rural isolation. And so he determined to find some unpretentious little town where there would be nothing to distract him. He refrained from asking suggestions from any of his friends, for he argued that each would recommend some place of which he had knowledge and where he had already acquaintances. As Malcom wished to avoid friends, he had no wish to encumber himself with the attention of friends' friends, and so he determined to look out for a place for himself. He packed a portmanteau with some clothes and all the books he required, and then took ticket for the first name on the local timetable which he did not know. When, at the end of 3 hours' journey, he alighted at Benchurch, he felt satisfied that he had so far obliterated his tracks as to be sure of having a peaceful opportunity of pursuing his studies. He went straight to the Traveller's Rest, the one inn which the sleepy little place contained, and put up for the night. Benchurch was a market town, and once in 3 weeks was crowded to excess, but for the remainder of the 21 days it was as attractive as a desert. The day after his arrival he tried to find quarters more isolated than so quiet an inn as the Good Traveller afforded. There was only one, an old, rambling, heavy-built house of the Jacobean style, with heavy gables and windows, surrounded with a high brick wall. It looked more like a fortified house than an ordinary dwelling. But all these things pleased Malcom. Here, he thought, is the very spot I've been looking for. From the post office, he got the name of the agent, Mr. Carnfoot, the local lawyer. He was a genial old gentleman who frankly confessed his delight at anyone being willing to live in the house. "To tell you the truth," said he, "I should be only too happy, on behalf of the owners, to let anyone have the house rent-free for a couple of years, if only to accustom the people here to see it inhabited. It has been so long empty that some kind of absurd prejudice has grown up about it. This can best be put down by its occupation, if only," he added with a sly glance at Malcom, "by a student like yourself, who wants its quiet for a time." Malcom paid 3 months' nominal rent, got a receipt and the name of an old woman who would probably undertake to do for him, and came away with the keys in his pocket. He then went to the landlady of the inn, Mrs. Witham, who was a cheerful and most kindly person, and asked her advice as to such stores and provisions as he would be likely to require. She threw up her hands in amazement when he told her where he was going to settle himself. "Not in the Judge's house," she said, and grew pale as she spoke. He explained the locality of the house, saying that he did not know its name, and when he had finished she answered, "Oh, sure enough, that very place. It is the Judge's house." She told him that it was so called locally because it had been for many years, a century or so back, the abode of a judge who was held in great terror on account of his harsh sentences and hostility to prisoners at the county assizes. As to what there was against the house itself, she could not tell, but there was a general feeling that there was something, and for her own part she would not take all the money in Drinkwater's bank and stay in the house an hour by myself. "Oh, it is too bad of me, sir, and you, and a young gentleman too, if you'll pardon me saying it, going to live there all alone. If you were my boy, and you'll excuse me for saying it, you wouldn't sleep there at night. Not if I had to go there myself and pull the big alarm bell that's on the roof." Malcom, although amused, was touched. "But my dear Mrs. Witham, you need not be concerned about me. A man who is reading for the mathematical tripos has too much to think of to be disturbed by these somethings, and his work is of too exact and prosaic a kind to allow of his having any corner in his mind for mysteries of any kind." After his examination of the house, Malcom decided to take up his abode in the great dining room, which was big enough to serve all his requirements, and Mrs. Witham, with the aid of the charwoman, Mrs. Dempster, proceeded to arrange matters. When the hampers were brought in and unpacked, Malcolmson saw that, with much kind forethought, she had sent from her own kitchen sufficient provisions to last for a few days. And before going, she turned and said, "Perhaps, sir, as the room is big and draughty, it might be well to have one of those big screens put around your bed at night. Though, truth to tell, I would die myself if I were to be so shut in with all kinds of things." The image which she had called up was much too much for her nerves, and she fled. Mrs. Dempster sniffed in a superior manner as the landlady disappeared, and remarked that for her own part she wasn't afraid of all the bogies in the kingdom. "I'll tell you what it is, sir," she said. "Bogies is all kinds and sorts of things, except bogies. Rats and mice, beetles and creaky doors and stiff drawer handles that stay out when you pull them and then fall down in the middle of the night. And don't you get to thinking anything else." She set to work with her cleaning, and by nightfall, when Malcolmson returned from his walk, he found the room swept and tidied, a fire burning in the old hearth, the lamp lit, and the table spread for supper. When he had finished his supper, he got out his books, put fresh wood on the fire, trimmed his lamp, and set himself down to a spell of real hard work. At 11 o'clock, he made himself a cup of tea. He had always been a tea drinker, and during his college life had taken tea late. The rest was a great luxury to him, and he enjoyed it with a sense of delicious, voluptuous ease. As he sipped his hot tea, he revelled in the sense of isolation. And then he began to notice for the first time what a noise the rats were making behind the wainscot. The tea began to have its effect of intellectual and nervous stimulus. He saw another long spell of work to be done before the night was past, and in the sense of security which it gave him, he allowed himself the luxury of a good look around the room. The carving of the oak on the panels of the wainscot was fine, and on the doors and round the windows it was beautiful and of rare merit. There were some old pictures on the wall, but they were coated so thick with dust and dirt that he could not distinguish any detail of them. The thing that struck him, however, was the rope of the great alarm bell, which hung down in a corner of the room. He pulled up close to the hearth a great high-backed carved oak chair, and sat down to his last cup of tea. When this was done, he made up the fire and went back to his work. For a little while, the rats disturbed him somewhat with their perpetual scampering, but he got accustomed to the noise, as one does to the ticking of a clock or the roar of moving water, and he became so immersed in his work that everything in the world, except the problem which he was trying to solve, passed away from him. He suddenly looked up. There, on the great high-backed carved oak chair, sat an enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. He made a motion to it, as though to hunt it away, but it did not stir. Then he made the motion of throwing something. Still it did not stir, but showed its great white teeth angrily, and its cruel eyes shone in the lamplight with an added vindictiveness. Malcolmson felt amazed, and seizing the poker from the hearth, ran at it to kill it. Before he could strike it, the rat, with a squeak that sounded like the concentration of hate, jumped up on the floor and, running up the rope of the alarm bell, disappeared in the darkness beyond the range of the lamp. Instantly, the noisy scampering of the rats in the wainscot began again, but by this time Malcolmson's mind was quite off the problem, and he went to bed and to sleep. He slept so soundly that he was not even woken by Mrs. Dempster coming in to make up his room. He was a little tired after his night's hard work, but a strong cup of tea soon revived him, and taking his book, he went out for his morning walk. On his return, he looked in to see Mrs. Witham, and to thank her for her kindness. She looked at him, and shook her head as she said, "You must not overdo it, sir. You are paler this morning than you should be. 2 late hours and 2 hard work on the brain isn't good for any man." But tell me, sir, how did you pass the night? Well, I hope. Oh, I was all right, he answered, smiling. Some things didn't worry me, as yet. Only the rats. And they had a circus. There was one wicked-looking old devil that sat on my own chair by the fire and wouldn't go till I took the poker to him. And then he ran up the rope of the alarm bell and got to somewhere up the wall or the ceiling. I couldn't see where, it was so dark. And with that, he went home to dinner. That evening, the rats disturbed him more than they had done on the previous night. Sometimes the boldest of them made sallies out onto the floor or along the mouldings of the wainscot. Now and again, as they disturbed him, Malcolmson made a sound to frighten them, smiting the table with his hand or giving a fierce shh so that they fled. All at once he stopped, as on the previous night, being overcome by a sudden sense of silence. He remembered the odd occurrence of the previous night, and instinctively he looked at the chair by the fireside. There, on the great, old, high-backed, carved oak chair, sat the same enormous rat, steadily glaring at him with baleful eyes. Instinctively, he took the nearest thing to hand, a book of logarithms, and flung it at it. The book was badly aimed, and the rat did not stir. So again, the poker performance of the previous night was repeated. On looking at his watch, he found it was now close to midnight, and not sorry for the divertissement, he stoked up the fire and made himself his nightly pot of tea. He'd got through a good spell of work and thought himself entitled to a cigarette, and so he sat on the great oak chair before the fire and enjoyed it. While smoking, he began to think that he would like to know where the rat disappeared to, for he had certain ideas for the morrow not entirely disconnected with a rat trap. Accordingly, he lit another lamp and placed it so that it would shine well into the right-hand corner of the wall. Then he got all the books he had with him and placed them handy to throw at the vermin. Finally, he lifted the rope of the alarm bell and placed the end of it on the table, fixing the extreme end under the lamp. He began his work again, and though, as before, somewhat disturbed at first by the noise of the rats, soon lost himself in his propositions and problems. Again, he was called to his immediate surroundings. There was a slight movement of the rope, and the lamp moved. Without stirring, he cast his eye along the rope. As he looked, he saw the great rat drop from the rope onto the oak armchair and sit there glaring at him. He raised a book in his right hand and, taking careful aim, flung it at the rat. The latter, with a quick movement, sprang aside and dodged the missile. He then took another book and a third and flung them one after another at the rat, but each time unsuccessfully. At last, as he stood with a book poised in his hand to throw, the rat squeaked and seemed afraid. This made Malcolmson more eager to strike, and the book struck the rat a resounding blow. It gave a terrified squeak, ran up the chair back, and made a great jump to the rope of the alarm bell and ran up it like lightning. The lamp rocked under the sudden strain, but it was a heavy one and did not topple over. Malcolmson kept his eyes on the rat and saw it by the light of the second lamp leap to a moulding on the wainscot and disappear through a hole in one of the great pictures which hung on the wall. "I shall look up my friend's habitation in the morning," said the student, as he went over to collect his books. Conic sections he does not mind, nor cycloid oscillations, nor the Principia, nor thermodynamics. Now for the book that fetched him. Malcolmson looked at it, and a sudden pallor overspread his face. He looked round uneasily and shivered slightly as he murmured to himself, "The Bible my mother gave me. What an odd coincidence." He sat down to work again, but could not attend to this work, and after striving to master the subject on which he was engaged, he gave it up in despair and went to bed. He slept heavily, but uneasily, and dreamed much. And when Mrs. Dempster woke him, his first request rather surprised the servant. "Mrs. Dempster, when I'm out today, I wish you would get the steps and dust or wash those pictures, especially that one, the third from the fireplace. I want to see what they are." Late in the afternoon, Malcolmson paid a visit to Mrs. Witham at the Good Traveller. There he found a stranger in the cosy sitting room with the landlady, who was introduced to him as Dr. Thornhill. She was evidently not quite at ease, and this, combined with the doctor's plunging at once into a series of questions, made Malcolmson come to the conclusion that his presence was not an accident. So, without further preliminary, he said, "Dr. Thornhill, I shall, with pleasure, answer any question you may choose to ask me, if you will answer me one question first." The doctor seemed surprised. "Done. What is it?" "Did Mrs. Witham ask you to come here and see me and advise me?" Dr. Thornhill for a moment was taken aback, but he answered at once and openly. "She did, but she didn't intend you to know it. I suppose it was my clumsy haste that made you suspect. She wants me to advise you, if possible, to give up the tea and the very late hours." Malcolmson, with a bright smile, held out his hand. "Shake, as they say in America," he said. "I must thank you for your kindness, and Mrs. Witham too, and your kindness deserves a return on my part. I promise to take no more strong tea, well, no tea at all till you let me, and I shall go to bed tonight at 1 o'clock at latest. Will that do?" "Capital," said the doctor. "Now, tell us all that you noticed in the old house." Malcolmson told in minute detail all that had happened in the last 2 nights. "I suppose you know," said the doctor, "what the rope is?" "Oh, no." "It's the very rope which the hangman used for all the victims of the judge's judicial rancour." Here he was interrupted by a scream from Mrs. Witham, and steps had to be taken for her recovery. Malcolmson had gone home before she could completely recover. When he arrived at the house, he found that it was a little after his usual time. The evening was cold, and a heavy wind was blowing with such rapidly increasing strength that there was every promise of a storm during the night. The reading lamp was lit, and its green shade kept the ceiling and the upper part of the room in darkness, so that the cheerful light from the hearth, spreading over the floor and shining on the white cloth laid over the end of the table, was warm and cheery. Malcolmson sat down to his dinner with a good appetite and a buoyant spirit. After his dinner and a cigarette, he sat steadily down to work. For an hour or so, he worked all right, and then his thoughts began to wander from his books. By this time, the wind had become a gale, and the gale a storm. Even the great alarm bell on the roof must have felt the force of the wind, for the rope rose and fell slightly. Malcolmson went over to the fireplace and took it in his hand to look at it. There seemed a sort of deadly interest in it, and as he stood there, he lost himself for a moment in speculation as to who these victims were, and the grim wish of the judge to have such a ghastly relic ever under his eyes. As he stood there, the swaying of the bell on the roof lifted the rope now and again, but presently there came a new sensation, a sort of tremor in the rope, as though something was moving along it. Looking up instinctively, Malcolmson saw the great rat coming slowly down towards him, glaring at him steadily. He dropped the rope and started back with a muttered curse, and the rat, turning, ran up the rope again and disappeared. At the same instant, it occurred to him that he had not investigated the lair of the rat, or looked at the pictures as he had intended. He lit the other lamp without the shade, and holding it up, went and stood opposite the third picture where he had seen the rat disappear on the previous night. At the first glance, he started back so suddenly that he almost dropped the lamp. His knees shook, and heavy drops of sweat came on his forehead as he trembled like an aspen. But he was young and plucky, pulled himself together, and after the pause of a few seconds, stepped forward again, raised the lamp, and examined the picture, which had been dusted and washed. It was of a judge, dressed in his robes of scarlet and ermine. His face was strong and merciless, evil, crafty and vindictive, with a sensual mouth, hooked nose of ruddy colour, and shaped like the beak of a bird of prey. The rest of the face was of a cadaverous colour. The eyes were of peculiar brilliance, and with a terribly malignant expression. As he looked at them, Malcolmson grew cold, for he saw there the very counterpart of the eyes of the great rat. The judge was seated in a great high-backed carved oak chair on the right-hand side of a great stone fireplace where, in the corner, a rope hung down from the ceiling, its end lying coiled on the floor. With a feeling of something like horror, Malcolmson recognised the scene of the room as it stood, and gazed around him in an awestruck manner, as though he expected to find some strange presence behind him. Then he looked over to the corner of the fireplace, and with a loud cry he let the lamp fall from his hand. There, in the judge's armchair, with the rope hanging behind, sat the rat, with the judge's baleful eyes, now intensified and with a fiendish leer. The fallen lamp recalled Malcolmson to himself. Fortunately, it was of metal, and so the oil was not spilled. He mixed himself a good stiff glass of brandy and water, and sat down to his work. It was nearly an hour when he looked up from his book, disturbed by the sudden stillness. The fire had fallen low, and had ceased to flame. Malcolmson listened, and presently heard a thin, squeaking noise, very faint. It came from the corner of the room where the rope hung down, and he thought it was the creaking of the rope on the floor as the swaying of the bell raised and lowered it. Looking up, however, he saw in the dim light the great rat clinging to the rope and gnawing it. As he looked on, the job was completed, and the severed end of the rope fell, clattering on the oaken floor, whilst for an instant the great rat remained like a knob or tassel at the end of the rope, which now began to sway to and fro. Malcolmson felt for a moment another pang of terror, as he thought that now the possibility of calling the outer world to his assistance was cut off. But an intense anger took its place, and seizing the book he was reading, he hurled it at the rat. The blow was well aimed, but before the missile could reach him, the rat dropped off and struck the floor with a soft thud. He rushed over toward it, but it darted away and disappeared in the darkness of the shadows of the room. Malcolmson felt that his work was over for the night, and determined to vary the monotony of the proceedings by a hunt for the rat, took off the green shade of the lamp so as to ensure a wider spreading light. As he did so, the pictures on the wall stood out boldly. From where he stood, Malcolmson saw the third picture on the wall to the right of the fireplace. He rubbed his eyes in surprise, and a great fear began to come upon him. In the centre of the picture was a great irregular patch of brown canvas, as fresh as when it was stretched on the frame. The background was as before, with chair and chimney corner and rope, but the figure of the judge had disappeared. Almost in a chill of horror, Malcolmson turned slowly round, and then he began to shake like a man in a palsy. His strength seemed to have left him, and he was incapable of action or movement. He could only see and hear. There, on the great high-backed carved oak chair sat the judge, in his robes of scarlet and ermine, with his baleful eyes glaring vindictively, and a smile of triumph on the resolute, cruel mouth, as he lifted with his hands a black cap. Malcolmson felt as if the blood was running from his heart, as one does in moments of prolonged suspense. There was a singing in his ears. He could hear the roar and howl of the tempest, and through it came the striking of midnight in the marketplace. He stood with wide-open, horror-struck eyes, breathless. As the clock struck, so the smile of triumph on the judge's face intensified, and at the last stroke of midnight he placed on his head the black cap. Slowly and deliberately, the judge rose from his chair and picked up the piece of the rope which lay on the floor, drew it through his hands as if he enjoyed its touch, and then deliberately began to knot one end of it, fashioning it into a noose. This he tightened and tested with his foot, pulling hard at it till he was satisfied, and then making a running noose of it, which he held in his hand. He began to move along the table on the opposite side to Malcolmson, keeping his eyes on him until he had passed him, when, with a quick movement, he stood in front of the door. Malcolmson then began to feel that he was trapped, and tried to think of what he should do. He saw the judge approach, and raise the noose and throw it towards him as if to entangle him. With a quick effort, he made a movement to one side and saw the rope fall beside him. Again, the judge raised the noose and tried to ensnare him, ever keeping his baleful eyes fixed on him, and each time he just managed to avoid it. So this went on for many times, the judge seeming never discouraged nor discomposed at failure, but playing as a cat does with a mouse. At last, in despair, Malcom cast a quick glance round him. The lamp seemed to have blazed up, and there was a fairly good light in the room. He looked around and saw that the rope of the great alarm bell was laden with rats. Every inch of it was covered with them, and more were pouring through the small circular hole in the ceiling whence it emerged, so that, with their weight, the bell was beginning to sway. Hark! The clapper had touched the bell. The sound was but a tiny one, but the bell was only beginning to sway, and it would increase. At the sound, the judge, who had been keeping his eyes fixed on Malcom, looked up, and a scowl of diabolical anger overspread his face. His eyes fairly glowed like hot coals, and he stamped his foot with a sound that seemed to make the house shake. A dreadful peal of thunder broke overhead as he raised the rope again, whilst the rats kept running up and down the rope as though working against time. The judge now drew close to his victim and held open the noose as he approached. As he came closer, there seemed something paralysing in his very presence, and Malcom stood rigid as a corpse. He felt the judge's icy fingers touch his throat. The noose tightened. Then the judge, taking the rigid form of the student in his arms, carried him over and placed him standing in the oak chair, and stepping up beside him, put his hand up and caught the end of the swaying rope of the alarm bell. As he raised his hand, the rats fled squeaking and disappeared through the hole in the ceiling. Taking the end of the noose, which was round Malcom's neck, he tied it to the hanging bell rope, and then, descending, pulled away the chair. When the alarm bell of the judge's house began to sound, a crowd soon assembled. Lights and torches of various kinds appeared, and soon a silent crowd was hurrying to the spot. They knocked loudly at the door, but there was no reply. Then they burst in and poured into the great dining room. There, at the end of the rope of the great alarm bell, hung the body of the student, and on the face of the judge in the picture was a malignant smile.